So let's kick it off. Here's the book, Stijn's new book, Why Psychosis is Not So Crazy. The second title is A Roadmap to Hope and Recovery for Families and Caregivers. And I finished it just a few days ago and had a very good time reading it. And I'm very excited to talk to you, Stijn, about it today. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and thanks a lot for the invitation, of course. Yeah.
So I'll begin by saying that, well, it's clear that your contribution to clinical psychology, particularly psychoanalysis, and particularly the Lacanian perspectives, are renowned worldwide. And I think people already know some of your writings, those that are joining us here. And I think that your writing is always very clear, very concise. To me, it reminds something of the Freudian scientific rigor. But this book stands out, I think, in your effort to connect with a broader audience. And well, it seems to me, at least after reading the book, that you've done a remarkable job translating complex insights that clearly come from the Lacanian orientation into a language that is accessible to people who are not familiar with psychoanalysis, with Lacan, and I really find that truly commendable. So I wanted to start by asking about the intended readership of the book. The title also already suggests families, caregivers, but I'd like you to, if you could elaborate in your own words, who in our audience you believe would benefit most from reading the book.
Yeah. So maybe I can tell you, of course, by practicing, and because of the fact that I teach at university, in recent years I've been talking to really different kinds of audiences. And for example, in clinical work, when working with like maybe someone who has been struggling with a psychotic episode, or maybe working with a parent or a partner who has a relative who has had psychotic episodes or is struggling with acute psychosis, I have to say something. I have to speak because in the treatment of psychosis, it's not just a matter of like just remaining silent and having a poker face and not giving answers to specific questions. So in my practice, I had to give answers to people about questions they were having, and the same is true. Like when I teach to clinical psychology students, most of them don't have a specific interest in psychoanalysis the moment they start their psychology studies, but I think it's my duty to talk with them in a language that is not frightening them, but rather triggering some interest, and talking about clinical problems like psychosis, for example. I think helps people to join a psychoanalytic way of thinking and speaking. So it was by doing all this that I kind of came to the conclusion, like, why wouldn't I write something for this broad audience of many different kinds of people who have an interest in psychosis. And then more specifically, it was also triggered by the fact that there was one person, Brenner, who was a Flemish activist with psychosis vulnerability. And she, at one point when I was having a discussion with her, she mentioned me like, okay, when I had my first psychotic breakdown and I went to the library to read and to find books on psychosis, these were so depressing. It were either like very biological books that were giving advice like you will have to take medications the rest of your life, and like a very deterministic line of reasoning, or works that were very incomprehensible. And for example, she had tried to read the Aryan leaders what is madness? And she said, like, after 50 pages, I had to stop because it's about case studies and things like that. And that's not really my background. I'm not a clinician. And so that comment also by her was for me like, okay, but what if someone who has a psychotic episode, or a relative, or maybe a nurse or a social worker who is working in the clinic, is asking a question about psychosis? What exactly is it? Then maybe me as a clinician and maybe me as a psychoanalyst can start answering that question. And it's a different kind of answer that I give compared to, for example, a biologically trained psychiatrist. And I thought that this psychoanalytic Lacanian voice needed to be articulated in a clear way. And that's how I decided to make this book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when you made it, did you have a particular audience in mind? Was it mostly for those experiencing psychosis? Those
No, it was like for the different kinds of people that I've been mentioning, like for patients, for their relatives, but also for mental health care workers who have hands-on questions when working with psychosis, and maybe also because for people who have an intellectual interest in the status of psychosis in society. So I wanted to go like very broad, and this was new for me because I tend to write for other academics or for other psychoanalysts, and that was my safe zone. This other way of writing. So for me, it was like something exciting and dangerous and very new to try to do this. But I had this very broad audience in mind.
I think you did a very good job, and I've already talked to some people in the crowd today that had told me they've read the book and found it very compelling. Let's get to it. Let's get to one of, let's say, a profound idea I think that's important to explore, and this is something that you mentioned already at the outset of the book. This is the idea that psychosis is an inherent part of being human. You say that it reveals something fundamental about the human condition, and here comes the Lacanian twist, particularly at the very edge of our freedom.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, what does psychosis teach us about the human experience? If you can tell us a little bit, and maybe also about the limit we encounter within it.
Yeah. Well, that's a very broad question. I could talk an hour about it, but I won't do that. But actually, it comes from a discussion between Lacan and Henri A., who was like a contemporary of Lacan, a psychiatrist in Paris, who had more of an academic career. They were trained together, and at a certain point, they have been discussing the question of psychosis. And Henri A. was like a bit more at the side of like, we have to be careful in giving diagnosis because it's limiting people's freedom, because maybe it's stigmatizing. And then Lacan's point was, no, we have to give the diagnosis of psychosis because it touches very specifically on the question of human freedom. So it's kind of a bit the paradoxical Lacanian intervention in that field. And when I take that quote, it is, in my view, so interesting because it shows that for Lacan, the human being is free to the extent that we are not determined purely at the biological level, which is already an idea from Freud, of course, like the distinction between the instinct and the drive. The drive is something that puts us on the scene with a living body that has impulses, that has a certain jouissance, but that jouissance is not directed in the sense that we don't know exactly how to deal with it. And at a certain point, I refer to Nietzsche, who said, like, the human being is a sick animal. Well, in a certain sense, we are all a bit have this same sickness in the sense that we are lacking something very fundamental already biologically. And this is a challenge, but it opens a domain of freedom because it opens the possibility of choice.
Mm-hmm.
If I, in my sexual behavior, am not completely determined by my hormones, then that means that there is an ethical thing at stake. Like I have to take a decision. And when I have to take a decision, there is some possibility of freedom. It's not that everything is possible, but there is some freedom, and that freedom is ethical. And then I would say, like, okay, this is a starting position. Then what is neurosis? What neurosis is actually the choice for convention. Mm-hmm. The neurosis means that you adopt the law of your culture, the law of your family, the law of your group, and you take it as your frame of reference to kind of frame these existential challenges, these aspects of a non-existence, I would say, with the later Lacan. We deal with these questions of the non-existence by making use of the law of culture, and we try to translate it into something of an existence, how to exist as a sexuated being, as a parent. And that's the neurotic solution. And in neurosis, of course, we know it results in division, subjective division, because there's doubt, do I make the right choice or not? But what is then psychosis? Well, psychosis is the inability to make use of convention, simply because convention is not compelling, convention is not appealing, convention is not speaking to someone, so it's not of help. It's not that convention is not known, but it might be, and that's the possibility of psychosis, that it's just not saying something for you. And if convention is not there as a source of inspiration, you're there on your own. And then you're at the point of freedom. And for me, that's exactly the point where Lacan is situating madness. Madness means that you don't have like the conventional way of making up reality at your disposal, which means that reality tends to go crazy, which also means that you will have to invent. And so at that point, you're very free, but it's very challenging as well. It's anxiety provoking. And that's a contrast with the typical neurotic solution, which is more conventional and which, in a sense, is stupid because you don't think. You don't use your possibility of freedom at that level. So stupidity and being an idiot is, in Lacan's later line of reasoning, very typical of neurosis, whilst like being more free, but it comes with a cost of loneliness and of having to bear these very difficult questions yourself is typical of psychosis.
Mm-hmm. But let's maybe try and nuance this a bit. It is not, I'm sure that you mean that psychotic experience is utterly detached from convention. I think we might say, someone can follow the law, follow rules, okay? Follow rules, but then know nothing about the law. I was wondering if you can maybe nuance this relationship to convention when we think about psychosis versus neurosis.
Yeah, well, indeed, convention, of course, here I mean like the idea of indeed the law, like the trust that what is being said, what is being articulated is true, is like, this is how it is. Mm-hmm. And I think that neurosis is an attempt to believe and to accept that there is something of a lawfulness, as if it was a law of nature in the things that we take from culture. Like, for example, the way we think about romantic relationships, we think of it, for example, in neurosis, people think of it in terms of a law, the law of love. And they try to believe in it, although they know that it's not exactly a law, but they try to behave as if it is a law. And it's this way of acting that in psychosis, I think that Lacan is pointing to that very specific point, that in psychosis is not operating the same way. So it's what Freud called the Ungloben. So it's almost an impossibility to believe that it is true, because it's already seen as, okay, this is just one way of thinking about it, but it's not acting as a support for me. And of course, that does not mean that the stories are not known, and that the contents and the figures that are all there in our cultural narratives, that they would not be there, but they, and this is typically what happens during psychotic experiences. These elements all return, but in a bit of a different way. Like in a delusion, for example, take Schreber, God is also there in his delusion. And where does God come from? Well, from our cultural narrative. But Schreber's God is a different kind of God. And why is he different than Lacan's line of reasoning? It's because he's not behaving according to the law of how a God behaves. And therefore, Schreber experienced him, for example, as an abusing figure. And I think there is something of that. So in that is so typical of psychosis.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's try and give it another twist of the screw. But I'll ask you in advance, because I'll ask about symbolic, imaginary, to tell us also a little bit about this for people who don't know. Because you rely on Lacan, and it's very clear, I think, in the book that a linguistic theory stands behind these developments in psychoanalytic technique and metapsychology. And you explain, I think, quite very clearly in the book, how in psychosis, a gap in the symbolic creates a gap in the imaginary. So there's a certain disruption in language that disrupts the continuity of mental life. So if you could tell us a little bit about your connection between psychosis and language, and how do you view this relationship as shaping our understanding of psychosis?
Yeah. So maybe let's start with these three registers: the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. The real, well, what I earlier discussed about the questions of existence, or the dilemmas of existence that are connected to the drive register, like our sexuality, but also like being a parent, being alive, having a body. In Lacan's line of reasoning, it's precisely because it's just a biological impulse, but without an inherent knowledge, it is real. And why is it real? Because we don't know how to deal with it. It's perplexing in a certain sense. That's the real. And then the idea is that the human being uses the imaginary and the symbolic to kind of treat the real, to try to do something with it. And then the imaginary refers to the register of images, meaning like mental representations that we build about reality. And often when we think about our consciousness, consciousness means that we have like a cinematographic representation in our minds, where we could, for example, think about breakfast this morning and immediately see what we have been eating. And maybe we see a little movie-like thing, we like putting the food in our mouth. Well, that is the imaginary, like this kind of filmic construction that we have in consciousness. So that's the second register. And then the register of the symbolic is the register of language use. And here we could say that the human being treats the real with words, or as Lacan would say, with signifiers. And these signifiers function in like web-like structures. And my idea is that we cover up reality with such a web-like structure of signifiers. And these signifiers, of course, provoke meanings and ideas. And that's how there is an interaction between the symbolic and the imaginary. So, but generally speaking, the symbolic and the imaginary are our ways of dealing with the real. And that's in Lacan's theory, like the universal idea. Any human subject is functioning that way. And here, what is then typical of psychosis, then the idea is that there is something of a whole of something that is missing, that is not functioning at the level of the symbolic. So there is an impossibility to kind of create something of a narrative around certain dilemmas in life that you've been confronted with. And that results in a very specific way of experiencing, because if we traditionally link the symbolic to the imaginary, and we kind of create representations and not just cinematographic images, but like little scenarios about life, then in a Freudian perspective, we are doing secondary process thinking. And what is secondary process thinking in Freud's line of reasoning? Well, that's exactly creating logically coherent ideas about the world. But what happens then if this is failing, like is the case in psychosis? Well, when we again switch to Freud would say, like, at that point you will see primary process thinking. What is primary process thinking? Well, that's the very associative way of dealing with the elements of mental life, where it's no longer about the logical coherence and the comprehensibility in terms of what I can share with someone else, but like a very associative way of connecting elements that have formal similarities, like similar sounds or similar colors or similar letters or numbers that return. And Freud's idea was like, this is dominant both in dreams and in psychosis. And with Lacan, I would say, like, well, it is this way of spontaneous associative thinking that will come to the fore at the moment of a psychotic breakthrough. And this is kind of my general conceptual tool in the book to situate, as you could see, like many different kinds of psychotic experiences as operating at these levels of making sense of reality, or having a difficulty or something not at your disposal in making sense of reality.
Yes, I think both the theme of the primary and secondary processes, as well as the metaphor of the film, is a thread that repeats in the chapters of the book, and it's very helpful to ground the different notions and ideas that you present, even when you engage with more complex concepts like imaginary, symbolic, and real. I'd like to maybe focus on one thing that you mentioned, this whole. And in this sense, it reminds me, of course, of some notion in the Lacanian framework that speaks of a distinction between a structure of psychosis, let's say, some structure that bears a whole. A whole is a hallmark, maybe, of this type of structuring. And then on the other side, a manifest psychosis and a psychotic crisis. So I think it's quite an important distinction. I wonder if you can clarify the difference between these and explain how they relate to each other.
Yeah. Well, in the book, I make this distinction between discrete psychotic experiences and manifest psychotic experiences to differentiate between both. Mm-hmm. And discrete psychotic experiences are like the things that people can feel or start to experience in their being in reality, where something of me using language to master reality and me creating images to construct reality, when something strange is happening to that process, where something of an automatism, for example, comes in. And this is for me typical in line with what Lacan also says, of course, like of discrete psychotic experiences. And it's discrete because here we don't have hallucinations, here we don't have delusions, but reality itself starts to behave in a strange way. And it can be the outside reality, but it can also be the inside reality. And here in the book, I describe like how some people's bodies start to act in strange ways, in the sense that suddenly things can happen that are felt physically in the body that people are perplexed by, Or it could be at a mental level where, for example, words start jumping around, or suddenly you start having ideas, imposed thoughts of which you don't have the feeling that you have been thinking them, but nonetheless they are in your mind. Or it could be like behavioral impulses, like some people be a witness to the fact how they tend to be aggressive, but they don't want to be aggressive, but they can have an aggressive tendency in themselves for which they are afraid. And so these are my line of reasoning are like the discrete psychotic phenomena, which indeed we can see as just the encounter of how the symbolic and the imaginary don't kind of function in the confrontation with something of the real. But at that point, you won't see like this triggering of the primary process associative thing. Mm-hmm. And this is exactly what will happen in manifest psychotic experiences when we have delusions and when we have hallucinations. And typical there is that it will always start from a revelation. And what is a revelation? It's really the experience of a concrete thing that is being manifested to me from outside. Like a voice, for example, in the context of a hallucination, or in the context of a delusion, a sign, like something that happened, something that says something to me, a revelation of an element that I kind of give an interpretation to. Of course, in like a very specific way. But then it's when something of an action coming from outside is experienced that we can talk about manifest psychotic experiences.
And these phenomena commonly, I think, in films, in popular media, books, these phenomena, delusions, hallucinations, they often portrayed as something that is a sign of illness, a sign of degeneration, a dead end. But I think something that's very important that you stress in your book is that actually these phenomena, delusions and hallucinations, provide a way out of nothingness. This is how you write about it in the book. So I want you to maybe say a little bit about this stabilizing function or this productive function that you identify in delusions and hallucinations.
Yeah, so it's precisely because when we see that what is really like destabilizing is the confrontation with the real. If you're being confronted, and as I describe in the book, it's usually through specific moments, incidents in life, specific events in life. These trigger us as a human being to kind of act. And biology is not teaching us how to act. So we need ideas. And if there is no idea to guide me, I tend to disappear. I tend to disappear into something of a nothingness. And well, in the discrete psychotic experiences, often confront people with this nothingness, where they tend to lose everything, like their thoughts, but also their self-image, and there is a threat of a certain kind of a disintegration. And then the idea is that if there is indeed like this primary process generated mental life again, that this is already an attempt to do something to treat that difficulty. And that was a very early idea that Jung and Freud in their early work on psychosis were already articulating, like it is something of an attempt to survive in a world. So they are kind of, these phenomena are treating the basic problem, which for me as a psychoanalyst also means like we don't have to remove these phenomena. We have to think, of course, like how can we help the treatment, because it's something of a spontaneous treatment. How can we help that treatment? And then two important things, I guess, are like on the one hand, trying to listen or helping to listen to what is being articulated, because often hallucinations and delusions, they don't deal with random topics. It's very frequent that people have religious contents or sexual contents or like things that have to do with government and with the police and with being alive or being death. And so these are like specifically the existential topics that every human being is struggling with. But in an eccentric way, these topics occur in delusions and hallucinations. And then my point is, but it's not random. It is because you can also notice that the content is because they are working on a specific topic. So somebody who has, like, I'm again returning to Schreber, although I talk only a little bit about Schreber in the book. But Schreber, for example, he's treating the question of authority and of being a father for someone. And his entire delusion is around that. So it's not random. It's because he's being confronted with that problem that was challenging for him, and for which something of a more lawful way of thinking, a more common sense way of thinking, was not operative. So delusions learn and hallucinations learn us something about what people are struggling with. So there is a story to be told. There something can be created. So, and I think that stimulating people to do something with it, to create, to speak, and to give shape to what they have been experiencing, and to that this is an important track to follow. But on the other hand, it's also helping people to limit the experience, because often it's overwhelming. So helping people to limit it and to make it bearable, to make it human for themselves and not like devastating is another clinical challenge. And I think it's important to stress both. And therefore, psychosis is both something, a crisis, psychotic crisis is something that produces suffering. But on the other hand, it's also something that has the potentiality of illuminating something, of teaching something to a person about their lives. And I think this is very important to take into account, and very different from how in our Western context we tend to kind of think of psychotic experiences as the disease itself, and the content of a psychotic experience as nonsense and as dangerous to talk about, because the more you talk about the psychotic experiences, the more you move away from reality. This is often, like in more CBT-like contexts, the case that you have to stay with reality, whilst I think that psychoanalysis offers a possibility to also listen to the craziness, so to speak, of a delusion, because it's not just crazy. It's saying something, and it's an invitation for the person who experiences it to do something, to create something out of it.
Yes, I think Foucault, who has never said something good about Freud or psychoanalysis, said one thing good about it in his History of Madness. And this is exactly that Freud is open to listening to madness at the level of its language. I think this really distinguishes, as you were saying, the psychoanalytic approach to psychosis and the psychiatric approach to psychosis. Also taking account that medication, while useful on many cases, it also sort of reduces the depth and the content that actually appears, a content that can be worked with. But I wanted something I really wanted to talk to you, Stijn, because we just have a few more minutes. I have two more things I want to ask you. But the first, maybe I can riff on what you've said, that you don't only speak about Schreber in the book. And that's very correct. You mention a lot of figures, and especially figures from the world of art, like René Magritte, James Joyce, Kusama, Sven Unik-Id, I hope I'm saying his name correctly, and Eileen Sachs, among others. And you suggest that creative and inquiring minds like these, on the one hand, are quite vulnerable to psychosis. But also you say that art plays a role in their experience of psychosis. And in this sense, well, it might even be used as a means to cope during a psychotic crisis.
Yeah.
If you could tell us a little bit about this commentary on art.
Yeah. But about the cases, when writing the book, I decided to, on behalf of Schreber, to go for all the others are cases that are not commonly discussed within psychoanalytic literature and Lacanian literature in particular. So I wanted to go for new cases because otherwise we always talk about the same. And so I wanted to go for new cases. But indeed, my key idea here is that creation and creativity is crucial. And I think this maybe brings us back to your first question about the freedom, because what is artistic creation? What is artistic invention? It's like taking a little distance from convention, like a painter like Magritte, for example, or Yayoi Kusama. They kind of started like an own style. They don't copy. They don't take convention and just reproduce. No, they take it as a point of departure to go an own way. And here I think that that artistic creation is a certain use of freedom that the non-artistic person, an individual in the world, is not so in touch with. So therefore, I think that artists' creation and freedom are really connected. And also, particular is that an artist's creation is framed. He's typically, for an artist, is that they work in a workshop. Meaning like it's limited in time and space. And that's why it is possible to create something, because it's not everywhere, but it's in their local space that they are working. And here I see a link with psychosis, because when we have this problem of freedom in psychosis and this out of the box thinking, because the box is in a certain sense, there are holes in the box. So it's open box thinking is there. So here there is also a possibility of creation and invention. And I think within the Lacanian approach, we tend to stress this as a possibility, because the psychotic experience, like a delusion and a hallucination, is already something of a creation. That's already an invention of something. And my idea is that this dimension of invention should be stimulated. And people should be encouraged to find a register for themselves that is sufficiently in line with how their way of having primary process thinking. It should be enough in line with that. So if you are like a poetic mind, it could be poetry, or when you're seeing images and having imaginary associations, it could go in the direction of painting. So I think there is a possibility, and they can learn also something from the artist, in the sense that like trying to limit it in time and space. The moment you start working with it creatively, with this way of using your thoughts and imagination, that's the challenge I think for people in psychosis, like limiting it on the one hand, but on the other hand, like trusting it and doing something with it as well.
Mm-hmm. And this brings us to a very important figure that appears in your book. And I think it's one of my favorite chapters on the book. It's a chapter about Carl Jung. And you refer to Jung, maybe he is, but not in the terms of a sublime analyst, but as a sublime psychotic. And you describe how his work actually did this remarkable balancing act. It's exemplary, you say, to the way an individual experiencing psychotic crisis can find a way to treat themselves. You also connected to a very interesting concept from Jacques-Alain Miller, the concept of bricolage. So if you could, and I think we'll end our discussion, we'll open it to questions after. If you could just say a few words about Jung and bricolage, and we'll wrap it up there.
Yeah. So I'm not a Jung specialist, but at a certain point I discovered his red book, And the Red Book by Jung is like a very big manuscript in which Jung had been painting, but also using calligraphic writing. And the calligraphic writing that is there is something that was spontaneously revealed to him. Then I started like researching the history of that book, and of course it all began with him breaking up with Freud. When both guys broke up, Jung started to have what I would call psychotic experiences, like lucid dreams, but also hearing voices in the night that were whispering things to him. And Jung had the very good or creative the idea to note these things down and to keep like little diaries, to write these things down and to start drawing and painting and writing the text of it, of what he has been experiencing. And then we have this Red Book in the end that is visually impressive, just impressive. And also the style of it is very much in line with how he has had his revelations, with this tone of wisdom that is in it. And then my idea is that Jung did two things with it. So on the one hand, Jung takes the content from what he has been experiencing and makes a theory out of it. And here we can see that Jung is a true creative thinker. He's really thinking out of the box compared to Freud. So there is an innovation in Jung's work. And where does the innovation start from? Well, from the revelation in his own experience. And my idea, of course, is also that it is because Jung did this and dared to interact with how the unconscious was speaking in him, that he didn't go crazy. He had his very peculiar experiences, but he didn't go crazy. He kind of find the stability around it, and maybe like a certain savoir-faire, a certain wisdom of how to deal with it. But on the other hand, Jung kind of keeps having his entire life this eccentricity, which was already there in the way he was making that Red Book. But in my book, in the Yellow Book, I describe how Jung in his later life was building a castle at the border of Lake Zurich, where he kind of recreated a medieval-like atmosphere. And well, for me, it's a kind of atmosphere, a creative micro-universe that is very much in line with how in his mind primary process associations were working. And so for me, like Jung is a very sublime illustration of how when you move away from convention and all kinds of strange revelations come into your world, how nonetheless you can find a stability and be very creative, because that's what he was. And how do we see bricolage here? It's because it's like in the creative combination of things that something happens. And therefore, I also think that psychotic experiencing and psychotic creation is actually very good for our culture. And why is it very good for culture? Because it is there that new ideas are born. For example, so it's of course not all creation comes from psychosis, but I do think that psychosis is a really creative force at a cultural level. And so here again, I return to the first idea about how madness is linked to human freedom. I think that freedom of mind and out-of-the-box thinking and letting go conventions and experiencing something new is often related to psychotic creating. Okay, yeah.
It's a nice way to wrap it up, I think. But let's open it up to the people joining us today. First come, first serve, let's say.